is a little different in two ways. One, we're going to talk about staying safe on the back end of a violent encounter when somebody's already been hurt. Two, we're going to talk about something that's a little bit less about what's sold to women for self-defense or self-protection, well, personal protection, so much as what women's product is recommended for use to help keep people alive. Even if you weren't paying attention to the video title, you probably already have an idea of where I'm headed. The idea of using a tampon to treat a gunshot wound. My name is Annette Evans, and I am the voice behind On Her Own, where we explore what it means to survive and thrive as women, people who can't always count on having help to navigate the world. My background is in shooting and combatives, which means I've thought a lot about what it takes to solve violent problems, with everything from walking and talking my way out of danger to using weapons in my bare hands to force my way to safety. Beyond just feeling safe, I want to be safe, and I want to help you be safe too. One of the ways I'm doing that is through this series, where I take a hard look at the products and techniques that are marketed to women to see if they're actually effective, or if they just exist to take our money, time, and attention and make us feel like we've done something. The idea is that tampons are made of absorbent cotton, conveniently shaped and packaged even, to be placed right into where the, blood is coming out of a body. Since they work for periods, there's a persistent idea that they also work well if somebody has been shot, and we need to stop that bleeding too. I'm gonna guess that every woman watching right now has an extremely skeptical look on her face, knowing as we do how unreliable women's hygiene products are for preventing the embarrassment of periods leaking through onto our clothing. Even so, I hear on a regular basis that tampons should be included in trauma first aid kits as a cheap and easy way to manage the kind of bleeding we see when someone has been shot. So I sent my production assistant out shopping, then invited my friend and experienced medic, Craig Hall of Penn Tactical Solutions, to help me tease out the truth of this idea. Craig is who I learned a lot of my first aid skills from, including how to treat gunshot wounds. So he's the first person I thought of when this topic came up. Besides, he's got some really cool bleeding dummies that let us test it out for real. I know you might not believe me because I'm not the medical expert, so I brought one in. This is Craig Hall of Penn Tactical. He's actually who I've learned a lot of my medicine from for treating gunshot wounds, and he's kind of the first person I called when I went, all these people want to know if tampons work for gunshot wounds. So Craig, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you think about this topic.
My name's Craig. So I have been in EMS for 22 years. Right now my current role is I serve as a tactical medic for a regional counterterrorism response team. I've been teaching tactical medicine for the better part of 10 years. I'm affiliate faculty for NAEMT and sit on several national committees, including some military relations. This is pretty much what we do full time. I am going to throw out the warning, don't get your medical advice off of YouTube. I recommend you guys go and do the research about this. There's actually a great article by Andy Fisher that talks about a lot of the science behind not using a tampon to stop severe hemorrhage.
And I'll make sure to drop a link so that you can all see that. So we're going to show you a little bit about what this looks like on a really cool bleeding dummy trying to use a tampon, trying to use the proper materials, which is gauze. And then, because I know some of you just have to try things yourself, so we're going to show you a way that you can see for yourself a little bit clearer on camera, but also in your own home of what's going to work and what's not going to work. So we talked about why people think tampons work a little bit, and we've got this really cool dummy here that bleeds just like an arterial wound would with the femoral artery, and we're going to try tampons and see if they really work. So Craig here, well, tell us what you think is going to happen.
It's going to be ineffective. The reason being, tampons are designed to absorb small amounts of blood, typically in between 9 to 10 milliliters of blood, which is absolutely nothing considering the fact that a femoral artery bleed can push out probably 1,000 liters in just a few minutes.
1,000 milliliters.
1,000 milliliters. So what we're going to be doing is, Annette's going to put a little bit of pressure behind this bleed. We're going to take our tampon, insert it into our gunshot wound, use the applicator, and you can see just by squeezing it, it does very little to stop any type of pressure behind the bleeding.
It's just bleeding just like it was before. It's like there's nothing there at all.
Yeah, once it absorbs that small amount of blood, it's not going to do anything to stop the bleeding. It's important to note that people don't realize just absorbing blood does not necessarily stop bleeding.
All right. So what's better than a tampon?
So what we're going to use is this is what we call a non-hemostatic gauze. It doesn't have an active ingredient that either works with the body's clotting cascade or form a pseudoclot. So this is just plain gauze. The biggest difference between this and a plain gauze is you'll see that blue stripe. That blue stripe is a radiographic strip, so in a hospital setting they can tell where the wound cavity is based on the packing gauze. So first thing I'm going to do is I want to locate the site of active bleeding. I'm going to take my gauze, put a little power ball on the inside of it, and I'm going to place 1-for-1 pressure. And I want to fill this entire wound cavity with the packing gauze. Especially for a non-hemostatic gauze, the way that a wound packing gauze works is it puts pressure on the active site of bleeding and the wound cavity itself.
And you'll note that blood just isn't spurting anymore. And it's not like we stopped making the dummy work. This is all because of that gauze.
So all I'm going to do is take the rest of my gauze, put a snowball on top, and I'm going to hold a good 10 minutes of direct pressure for a non-hemostatic gauze, and at least 3 minutes of pressure for most hemostatic gauzes. Now once I pull this out, you'll be able to see the volume of gauze that went into that wound cavity, which is probably about 3 feet of wound gauze by 3 inches, as opposed to about the 4 square inches of gauze that you run into with a typical tampon.
Yeah, and that's an ultra tampon too, so this is even more than sort of the regular tampon that you would get for regular flow days.
Tampons are designed to absorb about 10 milliliters of liquid, and this is what that looks like.
So one of the things that's important to remember when you're dealing with especially gunshot wounds is we may have a rather large wound cavity, and one of the premises of stopping bleeding is to apply pressure to the site of active bleeding. So this is obviously a very large wound cavity, and for the sake of video, over exaggerated, but you'll see with our tampon just what little volume actually fills up.
And that's just a regular super tampon, so kind of in the middle of range of absorbency for a woman's period. So not a huge one, not a tiny one, kind of the average thing you'd buy in the store.
Next thing we have is a standard wound packing gauze. This one is from North American Rescue. This is a really cheap option for wound packing gauze. It's designed for wound packing, and you're not looking at something very expensive. This is about $3 for 15 feet. So what we want you to see here is just packing a regular gauze. A few things we want to note is, one, just the amount of the wound cavity that a standard gauze would fill up. A lot of people claim that they carry tampons versus wound packing because of the cost involved. This gauze here is about $3 to fill this entire wound cavity, whereas to get the same type of volume from a tampon, even at a budget price of less than a quarter, you would probably need about $8 worth of tampons to get that same type of volume within inside the wound cavity.
So we've now filled this entire glass of water with one package of wound packing gauze. And I think that something that's really cool, and we tried this before we got on video, was what happens when you pull that gauze out now. So this is all the liquid that it's absorbed. And we haven't packed it really tight or anything. We haven't tried to get it to absorb. The water started out about here. Look at how much is gone.
Well, I think the one thing that we need to stress to the viewers is absorbing blood does not stop bleeding. This is why we've moved to techniques like wound packing as opposed to just throwing more dressings on top. Even the old style of just taking dressings and throwing it on top until they bleed through and you throw more on top isn't doing anything to stem the bleeding. It's just absorbing the blood. Just because we're not getting blood all over the floor or ground doesn't mean that victim still isn't bleeding.
So you're saying that the important part about that gauze filling this glass isn't how much water it pulled out of it, but the fact that it filled this glass completely.
It took the volume, and you know, with that, if we were packing it in like you'll see when we go to the mannequin, we want to pack that wound entirely with gauze to exert the pressure on the side of bleeding to actually stop the bleeding as opposed to just absorb the blood.
So I have one more question for you. What happens if you buy the super duper ultra mega tampon? Is that going to make a difference?
No, because the reality is your average tampon is designed to absorb 9 to 10 milliliters of water, whereas the arterial bleed that we're going to show you, that can bleed out almost a full liter with just in a matter of minutes. So when you're dealing with, you know, to be able to stop the bleeding, you know, you would need multiple tampons, and once again, I can't stress it enough, soaking up the blood is not stopping the bleeding.
It sounds like that applicator is not going to make a big difference either.
No.
I like how that's just a no. Like I can't even just no.
Well, it amazes me that, you know, this myth has been going on since the Vietnam War, and one of the things that's come within the past few decades is we're actually being able to study how we handle trauma in the field. So this has been a myth that we've been trying to dispel as a community all the way back since, you know, the 1970s, and yet it still continues despite there's no evidence saying that it works. In fact, there's evidence in numbers saying that it doesn't work.
All right, sounds like it's time to buy a whole lot of gauze and keep the tampons for what they're actually good for.
And the reality is tampons are designed to, you know, deal with one type of bleeding, which isn't what we're dealing with when we're dealing with victims of trauma or injury. And you don't even have to go out and buy gauze. I mean, any cloth, you know, clean t-shirt, whatever you have, as long as we can get it inside that wound channel and put that pressure on the active side of bleeding, you're going to have more success with a t-shirt than you would a tampon.
So now that we've been through multiple ways of showing that tampons don't work to stop traumatic bleeding, why they don't work, and what works better, I think the verdict is an obvious one. One on her own bird. If you shove a handful of tampons into a first aid kit thinking it will be useful for any sort of wound care, it won't help stop the bleeding. It's going to take up precious space in your kit. It's going to cost more than just buying some compressed gauze, and it's just going to make you feel like you're doing something, when in reality, you're wasting precious seconds that you could be using to save a life with a cheaper, more effective solution like basic wound packing, even without hemostatic gauze.